Welcome back, art fans. This video is about Vincent's ear, how much of it was cut off, and why it matters. We will look at a controversial self-portrait with the exposed, mutilated ear, and we will examine inexplicably overlooked material which overturns the currently accepted narrative that he cut off the entirety of his ear. Buckle in for a paradigm shift, and stay tuned to the very end to see my humble painterly homage to Vincent's self-portraits. Note that I will refer to the artist throughout, with some unavoidable exceptions, as Vincent for convenience. This is because the American pronunciation of Van Gogh is an abomination, as is the British Van Gogh, and using the Dutch Van Gogh seems pretentious and produces phlegm.
Artist Vincent van Gogh, or Van Gogh, as we would say in the Netherlands.
As a fellow artist, I like to imagine Vincent and I are on a first-name basis. Before I launch into flipping the dominant ear narrative onto its back, I want you to consider something Vincent said about himself. What am I in the eyes of most people? A non-entity, an eccentric, or an unpleasant person. Somebody who has no position in society and will never have. In short, the lowest of the low. All right then, even if that were absolutely true, then I should one day like to show by my work what such an eccentric, such a nobody has in his heart. Who is Vincent in the eyes of most people today? Is he still an unpleasant, eccentric nobody? Or much worse, a violent madman who sliced off his own ear? Do we see his heart revealed in his paintings, or do we project insanity on top of them? For all of my adult life, I've been annoyed by the way artists are depicted in film. I suppose it's an attempt to make artists more interesting to the general public. Artists are portrayed as overly passionate, with no self-control, social skills, or sense of humor at all. It's as if, in order to compensate for being creative, artists must be wildly deficient in most every other way. Movies about Vincent are among the most offensive, and, incidentally, Julian Schnabel's At Eternity's Gate is the worst of the bunch. On screen, Vincent is portrayed as a pathetic nutjob, perpetually straining at the end of his leash and slashing at his canvases in a psychotic fury. Even documentaries reliably describe the painter as a tortured genius and a self-destructive martyr on a biblical scale.
But during his time here, he would also suffer a cataclysmic breakdown, culminating in an act of bloody self-mutilation. What led to the tragic downfall of this tortured genius?
Several days ago, I watched a documentary about Vincent's self-portrait with bandaged ear. The narrator was the award-winning, immensely popular English art critic Waldemar Januszek. It was an informative and entertaining film, but something nagged at me. Why had Waldemar repeatedly stated that Vincent cut off his ear and never elaborated that it was only a portion of his ear?
Everyone knows the story of him cutting it off with a razor.
How very grisly. To hack off your ear with a razor.
Why did he cut off his ear in the first place? Cutting off his ear. Why did he cut off his ear? So, when Vincent cut off his ear...
Where he cut off his ear with the blade.
Why perpetuate a sensationalist myth rather than straightforwardly tell us the truth? I went to look up a medical drawing I'd seen years ago showing the lower part of his ear was removed, but as relentless as I was in my search, I couldn't locate it anywhere. Instead, all I could find was a new drawing that had been discovered in 2016 and told a very new and different story. On top of that, there were myriad articles and videos everywhere asserting that, finally, based on this newly discovered drawing, we now conclusively know for sure just how much of his own ear Vincent cut off. The damning evidence turned out to be a sketch made by Dr. Felix Ray, who had treated Vincent at the time. The drawing showed precisely where the ear had been cut with a dotted line. With the exception of a tiny, drooping section of lobe, it had been completely shorn off. The jury had come to its verdict. The case was closed. Vincent was a raving lunatic who sliced his hair clean off in a fit of psychotic fury. It's like I'd been in a coma for 7 or 8 years. How had I, an artist myself, missed this groundbreaking revelation about one of my very favorite all-time painters? This new verdict didn't sync with my impressions based on books I'd read as a young adult, including a compilation of Vincent's letters to Theo. I was suspicious, but I had to be honest with myself. Was I just upset that I'd been wrong all along and reluctant to accept that the most sensationalist accounts issuing from the tabloid newspapers of the time were actually correct? And we're talking about the same level of journalism that reported Vincent as being Polish.
Every time I would ever bring friends or family to Arles, the first thing they would always know about Vincent van Gogh was he was the man who cut off his ear. And yet, when you look in art books, they say that he only cut off the lobe.
But right away, I found the evidence was less than airtight. The drawing wasn't made from direct observation, or for medical reasons, or when Vincent was hospitalized. It was sketched 40 years later for the novelist Irving Stone, who was penning the dramatic fictionalized artist biography, Lust for Life. Dr. Ray wrote on the note, "Happy to give the information you have requested concerning my unfortunate friend. I sincerely hope that you won't fail to glorify the genius of this remarkable painter as he deserves." The object here was to glorify the genius of Vincent in what was to become the most popular recounting of his life in literature and then in film. Would it be more glorifying and immortalizing for Vincent, as well as his doctor, if he were remembered as cutting off his entire ear? I was struck right away by this motive, which was, curiously, not to tell the plain truth. A couple years prior, the same doctor had described Vincent in an interview as a miserable, pitiful man, small of stature, who always wore an overcoat smeared with colors since he painted with his thumb. In addition to being demeaning, we know that the description of his stature and painting technique is inaccurate. He was known to be medium height and somewhat stocky, and he painted with brushes, as is clearly evident in a few of his self-portraits, as well as by looking at the conspicuous brushstrokes covering his canvases. And so, the final word on Vincent's ear is traced to a man who had already inflated and distorted the truth about Vincent's life. The drawing is not the only argument, however, as there is further contemporaneous evidence. At the time of Vincent's injury, according to the reportage in a local newspaper, Dr. Ray, Paul Gauguin, and a policeman said that Vincent had, quote, cut off the ear. However, this general phrase may have been used for shock value and doesn't specifically address the extent of the injury.
According to Gauguin, as he walked home that night, Vincent threatened him with a razor. Gauguin stared him down, and Vincent ran back to the yellow house, where he cut off his ear with the blade.
It's worth mentioning that most of what has been accepted as the definitive account of what transpired on the fateful night Vincent's ear was cut comes directly from the intimate journals of Paul Gauguin. And Gauguin, as it happens, was the prime suspect when the police discovered Vincent lying nearly lifeless in his bloodied sheets. Scholars have advanced the theory that Gauguin, who went about with a saber and was an accomplished fencer, accidentally nicked Vincent's ear while bluffing during their infamous altercation. Vincent, they argue, covered for Gauguin so that his fellow painter wouldn't go to jail.
But a new book says it was actually severed by a friend and fellow painter. We believe Paul Gauguin cut it off during a quarrel, he says, in the Yellow House at Arles. In 1888, Gauguin was staying in the house where Van Gogh rented rooms. Although the two geniuses often collaborated, sometimes even painting the same subject, their fights were epic, here explored in the movie Lust for Life. The authors of the book, using letters and police reports, claim that during such a fight, Gauguin, who was an excellent fencer, sliced off Van Gogh's ear. The two then made a pact of silence to save Gauguin from prosecution, and as it turns out, to give art historians something to argue about.
Artist Vincent van Gogh, or Van Gogh, as we would say in the Netherlands,
The theory is impossible to prove, but it would be credulous to accept Gauguin's version of the events wholesale, given his penchant for self-aggrandizement, as well as the possibility that his story could be an elaborate alibi. While art history has confidently declared Vincent cut off his entire ear after the confrontation with Gauguin, there's better evidence that he only removed a portion. In addition to written descriptions, it also includes drawings by another of Vincent's doctors, Dr. Gachet, and a little-known, unsettling self-portrait by Vincent. 3 documented accounts assert Vincent's ear was only partially severed. Number 1. A few months after the ear mutilation, pointillist painter Paul Signac paid Vincent a visit and claimed that it was, quote, the lobe of the ear, not the ear. Number 2. The son of Dr. Gachet, the doctor who cared for Vincent in his final weeks, including the time following his shooting and right up to his passing, saw the artist several times during that period. He has also stated on record that, quote, it was not all the ear, as I remember. It was a good part of the outside of the ear, more than the lobe. Number 3. After his ear healed, Vincent went to see his brother Theo and his wife Jo 3 times in Paris, staying at their apartment for a total of 6 days. And in her 1914 memoirs, Jo recalled that Vincent had, quote, cut off a piece of his ear. Significantly, the counts that he cut off all of his ear were in the immediate shocking aftermath of the event, mostly instantaneous impressions, and whatever remained of his ear would likely have been covered in blood, scabbing, and bandages. On the other hand, observations that only part of the ear had been removed were made long after it had healed, and with hours, days, or weeks of opportunity to get in a good look. But this is just the words of a few people versus a handful of others. The smoking gun was a drawing, which is a different caliber of evidence, so to speak. But what about the etchings and sketches that Dr. Gachet produced of Vincent on his deathbed? He drew the left side of Vincent's head, including the mutilated ear. The sketches were done immediately while Vincent lay in his casket, and the etchings were done shortly thereafter. The sketch at the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam shows a rough ear, and while the shape is not clearly delineated to my eye, it indicates that there's something there. Since the artist was clean-shaven and his hair short-cropped, the shapes couldn't be his beard or hair. The sketch is signed VR, which are the initials for Van Rijssel, which was Dr. Gachet's artist's pseudonym after the town where he was born. The sketch is inscribed, to my friend Theo van Gogh, July 19th, and also signed with Dr. Gachet. While no writing by Theo addressing his brother's ear exists, he was present at the funeral, and it defies logic that Dr. Gachet would send him a deathbed drawing with what looks like an ear if none were present. A comparable sketch at the Louvre in Paris also indicates an ear, but doesn't go into enough detail for my satisfaction. If there were only Dr. Gachet's sketches, I would scarcely count them as conclusive evidence. It's his etchings that are much more pertinent. Interestingly, Gachet was the one who taught Vincent to etch, which is why Vincent was able to make a fantastic etching of Gachet. It must have seemed only appropriate to Dr. Gachet to reciprocate with an etching of his dead friend, his patient, and an artist whose work he collected and championed. I was able to track down 4 separate etchings Dr. Gachet illustrated based on his initial sketches of Vincent on his deathbed. One comes from the Metropolitan Museum in New York, another from the Art Institute of Chicago, a third from Emanuel Bayer of London, and the last from the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. In each etching, the doctor clearly illustrated the mutilated ear. The multiple variations reinforce one another so that it is unmistakably clear that the doctor was drawing the top of the ear, including parts of the helix, the scapa, and the triangular fossa. This is most clearly evident in the version at the Art Institute of Chicago. Why are the sketches done by a doctor from direct observation at the time of Vincent's death, as well as his further etchings, all dismissed in favor of a single rapid sketch made 40 years later by another doctor? If you're still on the fence, hold tight because our main witness is about to take the stand. Enter what is probably Vincent's most harrowing self-portrait. The self-portrait of 1889, or the Oslo self-portrait, as it was named because it was housed in the National Museum of Norway in Oslo, was painted while Vincent was a patient at an institution for the mentally ill at Saint-Rémy in Provence. Significantly, he painted it after his self-portraits with bandaged ear and before his 3 final self-portraits. This is the only painting he ever executed during a bout of psychosis, and in a letter to Theo dated September 20th, 1889, he referred to it as an attempt from when I was ill. Notably, Edvard Munch, painter of The Scream, said that he found this painting scary because of the gaze from the self-portrait staring back at him. Since the 1970s, the Oslo self-portrait was thought to be a fake. However, in 2020, after a 5-year period of meticulous analysis, specialists from the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam were able to confirm the painting's authenticity.
Let's watch some crazy stuff, yo!
After a 6-year study by researchers, a rare Vincent van Gogh self-portrait, which was thought to be a fake, has now been lauded as a genuine work of art after a 6-year study by researchers.
Jeez, Rick,
the
oh my
painting on
God!
display at the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam was thought to be real until the 1970s, when questions about the color scheme and painting techniques were raised by experts. Louis van Tilburg, the museum's senior researcher, said an example of the painting's deviation from Van Gogh's usual style was, quote, a greenish tint for the hair, which he hardly ever uses. However, the canvas he used was his usual, and Van Tilburg went on to comment that the artist used tones of more dark and muddled vibrant blues and greens to reflect his dour mental state. This is part of what makes the painting so remarkable and even therapeutic. It is the only work that Van Gogh is known for certain to have created while suffering from psychosis, Van Tilburg said to The Guardian.
Hey, wait a minute, Rick. I thought this was a commercial. What's going on?
Relax, Morty. Don't worry about it. Let's just see where this goes.
Another doubt was his use of a palette knife, but it turns out the artist used the tool a lot to suppress certain parts of the paintings from appearing too lively. Van Tilburg said the artist was most likely trying to reflect his mental state by draining the vibrancy of it. The painting is now said to be a part of a temporary exhibit at the museum starting February 21st.
The painting was made 8 months after the ear slicing, and it remarkably depicts precisely the same outer corner of remaining ear as shown in Dr. Gachet's etchings. While I am the only person I'm aware of who has compared these images, experts have ruled out the notion that the Oslo portrait depicts the severed ear. According to Mark Brown, writing for The Guardian, for example, Van Gogh would have been looking in a mirror as he was painting, so the ear in view is his right one, not the one he famously severed with a razor blade in December 1888. The ear in the Oslo painting is vague and presumably deliberately so. I looked carefully at the entire collection of the artist's self-portraits, and this is the only instance where he did not clearly articulate the entirety of the ear. Nevertheless, the accepted argument maintains that it cannot be his left ear because he must have painted the picture based on his mirror reflection, in which case we are seeing his right ear, and he merely chose to blend out the lower half of it for unexplained artistic reasons. End of story. Unless you bother to look carefully at his very next self-portrait, simply titled Self-Portrait 1889. At first glance, you might think this corroborates the accepted version of reality. The artist has rendered himself at the same angle, and in this image, his entire ear is visibly undamaged. However, there is an enormous problem. You might be able to work it out for yourself if you carefully examine the next two pictures. Both paintings show the artist holding his palette in hand. The other hand is doing the painting. In Self-Portrait in Front of the Easel, January 1888, because it is a mirror image, he holds the palette in his left, non-painting hand. In Self-Portrait 1889, and which must also be a mirror image, he holds the palette in his right hand. According to the Van Gogh Museum, Van Gogh was right-handed. We're almost certain of this because in two self-portraits, he's pictured with the palette in his right hand. But because he painted himself using a mirror, you need to flip that image. Vincent is therefore actually holding the palette in his left hand and his brush in his right. The second image they used was Self-Portrait as a Painter of 1887 to 1888. We also know from portraits by Gauguin and John Russell that Vincent painted with his right hand. Curiously, the Van Gogh Museum didn't mention the third painting where Vincent holds his easel in his right hand, which would make him a left-handed painter. The self-portrait of 1889 is impossible as a mirror image, and no one I know of has noticed or mentioned this. The painting can't show his left side because his ear is intact, and it can't show his right side because that would mean he's holding his palette in his right hand. It can be confusing to try to flip images in one's head, so suffice it to say that either way you look at it, mirror image or not mirror image, the hand holding the palette can only be his left hand, in which case the corresponding ear can only be his left ear. But the ear is mysteriously intact. Somehow, the left hand and left ear don't match, in which case this painting is undeniably not a faithful copy of what Vincent saw in the mirror. Whatever the explanation is for this conundrum, it proves that Vincent wasn't restricted to painting mirror reflections. Furthermore, this portrait comes right after the Oslo portrait. How can we be so sure he relied strictly on a mirror image when painting the Oslo self-portrait, when he didn't do so with the very next self-portrait? He could have also used any number of techniques to paint himself, including relying on just his imagination. He painted the Red Vineyard and the Starry Night from observation, memory, and imagination, and somewhat more to the point, he painted himself on the way to work in Self-Portrait on the Road to Tarascon, 1888. There is only one reason given that the painting doesn't depict Vincent's mutilated ear, despite it looking exactly like that, and that is the argument, which I just proved false, that he never deviates from mirror images when making self-portraits. All of the more thorough evidence points to a section of Vincent's ear being sacrificed, not the entirety. Nevertheless, it's been decided that the words printed in the tabloid clickbait of the day, the apocryphal boasting of Gauguin, and the suspect doodle of a doctor known to wildly bend the truth about Vincent are incontestable facts. You may ask, why does it matter?
These images stand for the modern belief that genius and self-destruction go hand in hand. So, if he didn't cut his ear off, is that whole story built on a lie?
Affirmative. A genius with a Christ complex is comparing his suffering to the suffering of Christ.
Genius and self-destruction go hand in hand.
And basically, it's a drawing of an ear, and there's a dotted line, and it says the ear was cut with a razor following the dotted line.
That's what it looked like afterwards. So it really documents that he removed his whole ear. It must have been an incredibly painful thing to do, and it's...
You realize what a really gruesome thing happened. It brings home the violence of the act.
So, if he didn't cut his ear off, is that whole story built on a lie?
Affirmative.
Why did virtually every newspaper, news program, art institution, and expert who covered the discovery of Dr. Ray's drawing so easily conclude that Vincent cut off his entire ear and disregard the prior belief that it was only part? Why didn't they take Dr. Gachet's etchings into account? My hunch is that it's just the same mentality that is behind the laughably pathetic romanticized portrayals of artists we see in feature films. And the more outlandish the caricatures, the better. In the case of artists, and Vincent in particular, how we perceive the artist and how we appreciate the art are intertwined. While it likely sells more tickets to display the paintings of an alleged raving lunatic and
tortured genius
who cut off his own ear, it dehumanizes the artist, makes him other, nearly impossible to relate to, and views him through the lens of sophomoric sensationalism and malicious gossip. We continue to portray him as his neighbors who signed a petition to have him ousted from the community saw him, or else how he was perceived by the boys who mocked him and pelted him with stones. We make of the man a circus show freak, and at worst appreciate his art in the way people value and purchase the clown paintings of serial killer John Wayne Gacy, not for their inherent merit, but as conversation pieces. Vincent was a great artist in spite of, not because of, his bouts of mental illness. The startling clarity of his paintings that were made in a state of calm, that are about humility, vibrant nature, exulting in color, capturing the essence of life, and conjuring love, can end up clouded with an acidic varnish of our own projected demeaning cliches. We deny his humanity when we exaggerate his insanity. Consider what Gauguin wrote about Vincent after moving in with him in the yellow house in Arles and before the ear-slicing incident. I don't admire the painting, but I admire the man. He's so confident, so calm. I so uncertain, so uneasy. Vincent calm? Confident? Gauguin wrote about the house. In spite of all this disorder, this mess, something shone out of his canvases and out of his talk, too. He possessed the greatest tenderness, or rather, the altruism of the gospel. Do we look at Vincent's paintings as if they were painted by someone calm, confident, possessing the greatest tenderness and the altruism of the gospel? And instead of seeing the man as a
tortured genius,
consider how he saw himself, which is evident in the following quote. A painter really ought to work as hard as, say, a shoemaker. I plow my canvases as the peasants do their fields. And this following quote is from the last letter that he wrote to his mother and to his sister, describing one of his landscapes. I myself am quite absorbed with that immense plain with wheat fields up as far as the hills, boundless as the ocean, delicate yellow, delicate soft green, the delicate purple of a tilted and weeded piece of ground, with the regular speckle of the green of flowering potato plants, everything under a sky of delicate tones of blue, white, pink, and violet. I am in a mood of almost too much calm, just the mood needed for painting this. While truly understanding Vincent requires grappling with his mental condition and includes taking into account his paintings with bandaged or even an exposed, mutilated ear, it's time for us to let the man out of the straitjacket of grotesque exaggerations of his mental illness. In this way, we also cleanse our own eyes before his paintings. We allow his spirit and his illuminated canvases to radiate warmth and clarity, even if it's not good for the bottom dollar. I'm not saying I know for sure how much of Vincent's ear was shorn off, by whom, or whether Vincent painted his disfigured ear in the Oslo self-portrait or not. Here, I gave the reasons I am not convinced by the scant and eyebrow-raising evidence that absolutely persuaded others that he cut off the entirety of his ear. What I am certain of is that the proclivity to portray Vincent as an extreme caricature hinders our understanding of his work and does him a major injustice. It further highlights a propensity to stigmatize people who are experiencing mental health problems, and is an impediment to understanding how art addresses the human condition and to appreciating art in general. Thanks so much for watching the video this far, and now, as promised, here's my own homage to Vincent in the form of a digital impasto painting using my own custom techniques and portraying him as if he did a self-portrait with a freshly cut ear. And this is where my vested interest, I confess to, comes into play. I completed this artwork in 2016 and was not aware of Dr. Ray's drawing. And so, in retrospect, if everyone is right, I got the ear all wrong. It's art, so that isn't such a big deal, but it turns out I may have been closer to the truth all along. This image has been sold on the internet by other people for years and for up to hundreds of dollars a pop, but not only did I not get a cent for any of it, those are inferior copies because they were taken from a small JPEG lifted from my website. Now, finally, I'm making available high-resolution archival prints, posters, cards, and other products based on my full-scale image that only I can provide. See link in the description.
Here's a song that was beautiful when performed by my ancestor art. Are you going to Scarborough Fair?
Parsley, sage, rosemary,